further ado, I'm going to hand this over to David. David, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Also, at the end of this, we have a microphone that you can do some Q&A with. I have some volunteers that can help that. We got to use the mic because we're recording this so people can hear your question.
Okay.
Thanks,
awesome.
David.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon. My name is David Reyes. I'm a producer and business development manager for Immersive Experience Studios. We're a virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality production facility located in Meridian, Idaho. I am blessed to be here before you today, presenting on one of my favorite topics, which is 3D audio and spatial audio. All right. And specifically, there's 3 points I want to make. The first one is, 3D, spatial audio, they're here today, no waiting required. They're really a game changer between the interactivity of head tracking. If you think about when you've got a VR headset, you got head tracking, right? You shift this way, the sound shifts with you. That's really remarkable. The accessibility on mobile devices, streaming devices, desktop, playback devices such as the AirPod Pros, those support spatial audio out of the box. Soundbars and smart speakers, and then the result is what I call meta audio, where really audio is 60% plus of the overall experience, just because it is so immersive, it is so responsive. And then lastly, we're here to help, right? We're here to help the developers in the community, the consumers, really understand how to leverage 3D and spatial audio to create that awesome user experience. Before I get too much further into this, how many of you out there are consumers of audio? So show of hands, awesome. And then how many of you out there are developers? You develop VR, AR apps, web, mobile, anybody? All right, cool. I'm going to try to present information that will hopefully be relevant to the consumers as well as the developers. That's really my intent here. And then lastly, Immersive Experience Studios, we're here to help. We're here to help you really leverage so that you can get that awesome user experience from 3D and spatial audio, whether it's through production work or consulting, training or testing. I want to talk a little bit about my journey in this space. 2014, I was a product development manager for DTS. DTS is a Dolby competitor. They make a product called Headphone X, which is now called DTS X, and that's their spatial audio solution. And I remember being in one of these sound rooms that you see up here in the upper right-hand corner. And we were doing an A/B test with these little guys on a mobile device and the playback in the room. So we switch on and off, on and off. And when they got the room tuned and got the mobile device squared away, the accuracy and the clarity was startling. I couldn't tell the difference between what I was hearing in the earbuds and what I was hearing in the room. And that was when I realized what a game changer spatial audio really is. The second aha moment was 2015, coming out here to Idaho, attending some of the Idaho Virtual Reality Council meetings, had an opportunity to meet up with the folks working on this Polynesian Cultural Center VR experience. That's a spot out in Hawaii, and then the Luxor Temple VR experience for Boise State. And met some really, really talented VR developers, animators, folks who really understand user experience, software design. But on the audio side, there was a gap. They knew they needed audio, they knew they needed sound effects and narration, but they didn't really quite understand, what to do with it, right? It's one thing to take a track that you've downloaded from Audio Jungle or something, throw it into an experience and go, yep, I think this will work. It's another thing to handcraft music, sound effects, narration, right? Really think about what's its role, what is it going to do, how's it going to impact the user, how is it going to improve this experience for them? And so that was the second aha moment where I realized there was an opportunity here. There's a gap, right? There's an opportunity to really contribute to the community of developers. And then some images to help guide our journey. And by the way, if you have questions, please speak up. Happy to address any questions along the way. I'm going to try to keep this as interactive as we can. There's a lot of material here, so if I talk too fast, which I never do, or if I gloss over something that maybe is a little tough to understand, please stop me. I'll back up. I've tried to make this as clear and concise as possible. So a couple of images. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a typical surround sound home theater system, right? Looking at our Cartesian coordinate system here in the middle. Yes, I am an engineering geek, so I'm going to refer to Cartesian and polar and all those great things. You'll notice that all of the speakers are located in the XZ plane, in the horizontal plane, right? So it's really a 2D experience. But we know that audio is a 3D experience, right? So rather than this, right? We want to think about this, right? Think about the room that we're in right now, right? You're hearing me talk, but you're hearing the reverberations off the walls, right? You're hearing the sounds in the next room. You're hearing the radio over there, right? That stuff doesn't all live in this plane, right? It's up, it's down, it's below you, it's next to you, it's in front of you, right? So surround was good, right? Don't get me wrong, it was good. Surround sound, 3D and spatial audio is even better. If you look at a typical Dolby Atmos home theater system, you notice we have these elevation speakers in the ceiling, right? And so this is where we really start to get, in the Y direction, some movement in the audio. Now we can lift sounds up above the listener, right? We can presumably move them back down to that 2D plane. And so now we have this ability to move sounds in the 3D space, you know, helicopter flying from the back to the front, you know, missiles going across, right, explosions. And then lastly, down here at the bottom, we've got our super buff game dude who is our virtual listener. So he's in this 360 space, and he's listening to these sounds, and these sounds are being played back over these virtual sound speakers, if you will, right, over this 360 space. And I want us to keep this picture in our minds as we're going through the presentation. Everybody doing okay? Is this all making sense, resonating? Okay, so a little terminology. I want to move through this as quickly as we can. Don't want to overwhelm you with too many terms, but these will be helpful in our discussion around 3D and spatial audio. So when we say 3D audio, spatial audio, we're talking about recording and reproducing sound in this virtual space, right? So you know, if you think about placing microphones in a particular location, right, recording the sound, there's a specific, you know, thing that we need to do for ambisonic mics, and then reproducing that in a virtual space. These could be outdoor recordings, indoor recordings. Move on to number 2. Binaural audio, you know, really there's nothing more to it than listening over a pair of earbuds, right? Whether they're wireless or wired, right? It just means 2-channel listening over headphones. What's interesting to note about binaural reproduction is we have these things called HRTFs, head-related transfer functions, and that's here at number 6. These are, if you want to think of it as an abstraction of a sound space. So it describes the spectral quality, right? So for example, in this room, right, the HRTF would convey the fact that the floor is carpeted. It's not wood or cement, right? The walls have treatment on them, so that the room isn't really echoey or bouncy, right? If we were in a cathedral, it'd be a completely different HRTF, right? If we were in a big open warehouse space, you know, completely different HRTF, right? So that really describes the spectral qualities of the room to the ears. And for binaural listening, there's 2 HRTFs, one for the left ear and one for the right ear. All right, I'm going to go back to number 3. When we talk about surround sound, we're talking about channel-based audio, right? So if you think about our home theater system, what you can do in surround sound is you can pan audio to a particular speaker location, you know, left, center, right. Most of you have experienced this, right, either in the theater or in your home theaters. Narration is in the center channel typically. You've got, you know, sound and sort of the main things in the front, left, and right. And then in the surrounds, you have all the sounds bouncing off of the walls, you know, all the sort of ambient reverberations, right? I'm going to jump down to number 9. In the world of 3D and spatial audio, we talk about object-based audio. Now, this is a really, really different way to think about audio. So, again, our 360 sphere, right? In this instance, spatial audio, 3D audio, audio sources are treated as objects in the space. So that is, you know, they have an amplitude and phase, whatever, right? But they also have metadata associated with them, which dictates how the sounds are played back and changed over time. Right? So again, from channel-based to object-based audio. I'm going to jump to number 4. When we talk about direct and indirect sound, we're talking about sounds that, in the case of direct sounds, you hear them from the sound source directly. And then indirect sounds are those that reflect off of surfaces, right? So let's say, you know, there's a gunshot over there, right? Kaboom. You hear the gunshot, but then you hear all the reverberations off of the walls or off the canyons, wherever it is that you are, right? When we have those indirect sounds, we have reflections, right? Early reflections, late reflections. Early reflections are those that we hear within 80 milliseconds of the original sound source, and those convey most of the information about the sound source, about the room that we're in, right? About all of the materials and things, right? Those are really, really key. When we talk about late reflections, number 7, those are the reflections we hear more than 100 milliseconds after the original sound source. Those give us a little bit more information about the sound source and the materials, but not as much as the early reflections. Right? I'm going to keep going. We talk about HRTFs. Localization, this is really our ear's ability to place sounds in a space. So when I hear the jet flying overhead, I can tell that it's up here. It doesn't sound like it's flat on the floor. If there's a gunshot over this way, I can tell I should probably duck, right? If there's a car behind me, I know that I should probably look and see where they are, right? Occlusion, number 10. This is when you have an object between the sound source and the listener. Maybe it's a wall, maybe it's a dead zombie, I don't know. But something is blocking that sound, right, or affecting that sound. And then lastly, a sound field. We'll talk about those, right? I use those two terms interchangeably, right? Soundscape, sound field, so I'll distinguish the two. Sound field is nothing more than any place, whether it's a material or free space, where sound waves are propagating, right? A soundscape is what I think of is the kind of the sum total of music, sound effects, narration, right? It's all of the sort of the sound audio material that's being streamed or conveyed in a particular experience. I want to pause for a sec. Are we doing okay? Am I overwhelming you? Talking too fast, too slow? Audio's good? All right, there's a lot more to come. All right, so I want to back up again. I don't want to keep dwelling on the whole surround sound thing, but I think it's useful to do a comparison, right, between kind of surround, where we've been, 3D audio and spatial audio, right? Because I can tell you there's no shortage of confusion when you go online, like I do, trolling, for this material, right? When we talk about 3D audio, this is the middle column, we're talking about audio that's really dictated by the MPEG-H standard. This is a standard that's developed for broadcast and for cinema, right? The one exception to that, going over to our left column here, is the Sony Tempest audio engine, which is what Sony's been touting for their new PlayStation 5. That's a 3D audio engine for games, but it doesn't adhere to the MPEG-H standard, okay? And as we said, 3D audio, mostly broadcast, a little bit for games. Moving on to the right column, spatial audio. That's really dictated by a number of consumer formats. We talked about DTS, we talked about Dolby Atmos, right? Apple has their own spatial audio format for the AirPod Pros. The Oculus, HTC, they all have their own spatializers, right? Some work better than others, but these are all different formats, right? And typical applications for that, as we said, AR, VR, streaming, and mobile. Surround, of course, is mostly cinema and home theater. All right, I'm gonna keep rolling. So then for the consumers out there, where do you get your 3D and spatial audio? Just about anywhere, right? I've divided these by 3D audio and spatial audio, looking at VR and AR, as we said, the headset manufacturers, right? Sony, PlayStation VR. In the case of mobile, on Android, there's a technology called Hook Audio, and then Waves has their own technology. Spatial audio, of course, Apple iPod and AirPod Pros. For streaming, this is an interesting space. You'll notice that I have the Amazon Music streaming service and Sony 360 in both categories. The reason is because Amazon and Sony have their own 3D audio format, whereas in the spatial audio realm, Apple will stream Dolby Atmos tracks, which are spatial audio. So do Amazon and Sony. So they technically fit in both categories. Jumping back up, you'll notice that Spotify is in parentheses. Spotify has filed for a 3D audio patent, but we don't really know a whole lot about what they're doing just yet. We'll probably hear more about that next year. And then looking down at the other audio streaming services, we've got Tidal, Tencent. Tencent's a big streaming service in Asia. And then for video, we've got Apple TV, Netflix, YouTube, and Facebook. And these platforms for video are every day encoding more and more titles in spatial audio. For game platforms, of course, Sony supports 3D audio, Xbox for spatial audio, and then home theater, there's a technology, RO3D, and there are a number of audio-video receivers, soundbars that feature RO3D. And then for spatial audio, of course, we said Dolby Atmos and DTS. There are a number of devices that feature those. And then last but not least, let's not forget about our friends at THX, George Lucas's audio company, originally, they have their own spatial audio technology as well. Okay, we're doing all right? Everybody good? Okay, let's keep rolling. All right, let's talk about the evolution. So 3D audio, spatial audio, they really come from three disciplines. The first is ambisonics, and this is really an abstraction, again, describing how sound sources work, how they function in a 360 space, right? We think about the directional information, right? So again, we're not talking about, amplitude and phase, right? What we're talking about is where do those sound sources live in this 360 space, and how do they change and morph over time? The sound sources are encoded as spherical harmonics. That's just a term you need to know. I'm not going to dig into that because there's a lot of math involved, and I don't want to bore you with those details. It comes in a couple of different formats, A format and B format. And what you need to know about that is A format is the format that ambisonic microphones record in. B format is the format that's typically used by most of the software tools. So typically you want to do some sort of conversion between A format and B format. And here, for these two, we're talking about first order ambisonics, which is 4 directional, virtual microphones. And I want to be careful here. In a lot of the sites that I see where they talk about ambisonics, they mention channels, right? They talk about these 4 channels, right? X, Y, Z, W. We're talking about object-based audio. So if we start mixing apples and oranges, it's going to get very confusing, right? So when you think spatial audio, think object-based. Stay away from channels, please, otherwise you'll confuse yourself, right? Think of these as 4 audio streams, 4 directional ways to encode this information. I call them virtual microphones. It has support for higher order ambisonics, and this is really, really key. Higher order ambisonics give you greater granularity in how you control your sound, right? First order is 4, second order is 9, third order is 16, and fourth order is 25. So think about having a setup in your home where you've got 25 speakers where you're able to render audio, right? Think about the control that would give you, right? Think about, 8 in the ceiling, 8 in the 2D plane, 8 on the floor, being able to reproduce sound out of all of those speakers gives you a lot more control about how you place and how you move the sound in that space. Next up is wave field synthesis. This is really technology that enables you to reproduce a sound field using lots and lots of speakers, right? So if you think about, you've got this sound field you're trying to reproduce, and you take a room and you line it with speakers all the way around, and each one of those speakers emits a little tiny portion of that sound field, and those speakers are all pushing that sound into that space. That's what wave field synthesis is about. And what's important about that is it gives us the rendering of a sound space that's independent of the listener's position. I'm going to keep going. And then psychoacoustics, that's really the science and the physics of how we hear, right? That's where, localization, right, spatialization, all of those things come from, right? It's the study of, when sound hits our ears, what do our brains do with it? How does the shape of my ear impact that perception of sound? And then a little timeline, right? I tried to find one of these online. I couldn't, so I decided, right, I'm just going to build one myself. So starting in the 1970s, we see the evolution of ambisonics. I'm just going to go right along the top line here. Moving into the 80s and 90s, we see a lot of the evolution in spatial audio, 3D audio. It really is around surround sound in home theater and in cinema. Then jumping up 2001, we see the first truly commercially viable device with a streaming service tied to it, right? The Apple iPod and iTunes. Then the iPhone, it's the first smartphone that does mobile streaming. A bit more in the cinema, we see the first, Atmos film in 2012. And then from there, you'll notice the pace of innovation just increases rapidly. We start to see the streaming services come online, right? Sony and Amazon, YouTube and Facebook, right? The AirPod Pros in 2020. And then lastly, Apple Music announcing that they're featuring Dolby Atmos tracks in 2021. Okay, so for the developers, we're going to dig into a few of the audio solutions. I have a full list of these on my website at a free resource. I'll give you a link to that at the end of the presentation. I just chose the first 6 or so that I thought would be of most interest to the folks in the audience. I started with the free solutions because I like free stuff. Who doesn't like free stuff? And then at the bottom, we've got all the ones that you've got to actually shell out some money for. So I'm going to go through these, and we'll dig into some of the details on these. So going from left to right, when I talk about a DAW, a DAW, that's a digital audio workstation. That's a tool, software that's used by audio producers, mixers, post-production people to produce music, sound effects, narration, voiceover. It's kind of a utility knife workhorse for audio production. Next up is it supported in either Unity or Unreal, two most prevalent game engines? Is it available on the desktop platforms, Windows, Mac, and Linux? Does it feature support for iOS and Android? Does it support head tracking? Does it support higher order ambisonics? And then the most important, what is it going to cost you to get it? So just real quick, Facebook 360, this is supported on DAWs. It runs on Windows and Mac. It does support mobile devices, does not support head tracking or higher order ambisonics. We'll talk about that solution a little bit more in a minute. Resonance Audio, brought to you by our friends at Google. This has a DAW plugin and will work in both Unity, Unreal. Does have great support for mobile and head tracking, and it does support second order and third order ambisonics. Envelop is an Ableton Live specific solution. Ableton Live is a digital audio workstation that I use, brought to you by our friends at Ableton. This is an amazing piece of software. It doesn't work in the game engines, and it does support Windows and Mac. It doesn't support head tracking. It does support higher order ambisonics, however. Oculus, of course, has their own spatializer for their headset that's really optimized for use in Unity rather than Unreal. It does support head tracking. There is no support for higher order ambisonics, however. So first order is all you get with this spatializer. Dolby Atmos, of course, Dolby being the 400-pound gorilla in this space. They have support for DAW. It's Mac only. It does support mobile devices and head tracking. No support for higher order ambisonics. Waves is a Israeli company that produces a lot of plugins for mastering and mixing, used a lot in broadcast. They have some really great spatialization technology as well. That's supported on Windows and Mac, Android only. It does have head tracking. No support in Unity or Unreal, however. And then lastly, DearVR. This is a solution that's really great for Unity. It does run on all the desktop platforms, has mobile support, head tracking, and single order and third order ambisonics. So I want to dig into a couple of these and just talk a little bit more detail about them. The first one that comes to mind for me is Resonance Audio. This is open source. I'm going to jump down here to the pros. So you can download the source code from GitHub. It supports custom attenuation curves. And where this is really important is, let's say you've got a VR experience or some sort of social VR, game experience, and you've got kind of all these agents in a space. As they move away from the listener, you can customize how that sound drops off. A lot of the spatial audio technologies, it's kind of a fixed, 1 over the square root of the radius, right? So it will just drop off with some fixed rate. You may not always want that, right? You may want some sort of situation where, I don't know, it's some zombie being or something, and as they move away from you, quickly, or right, you want it to really, really drop off fast. Maybe you want it to drop off slowly, leave a little bit more of an ambiance there, right? I think that's really, really key with this technology. It is highly optimized for mobile, so if you're thinking about a mobile app or a mobile VR experience, I would go with this solution. I think it's really, really well done. It has support for first order ambisonics for speakers only for the web, so that's a consideration. It has higher order ambisonic support for headphones only. It doesn't have speaker out for higher order ambisonics. So that's a consideration if you're thinking about a situation where you need to render over speakers. And then Oculus. This is an awesome solution. It's really optimized for wireless headsets, for Oculus's wireless headsets. You'll notice this kind of list of cons. There's some things that it doesn't support that I'm a bit surprised. Maybe some of that's changed. I need to double check, the latest release. But last time I checked, they didn't support the Doppler effect. So Doppler is where, for example, you hear an ambulance kind of coming by you on the street, and as it's going by, the pitch of the siren kind of goes from high to low. That's really, really useful for a lot of things, right? Helicopters, bombs, right? All sorts of sound effects. If you don't support Doppler, then you need to find a way to do that yourself, and it's a lot of work. You've got to pre-render all that stuff and think about the timing in the scene. So that's kind of a big deal. It doesn't support occlusion. So if you're in a room, in a virtual room, in a sound situation where you've got a sound source out here and you've got barriers and things like that, you've got to do all that yourself. You've got to pre-render all that yourself. That can be a bit of work. So some considerations there. And then Dolby, we talked about them. What's great about this solution is you can hear Dolby Atmos tracks on mobile devices, on home theater, cinema. So you could conceivably render some audio in Dolby Atmos, listen to it over your home theater, listen to it on your mobile device, on these guys. There's a lot of things you can do with Dolby Atmos. Some of the things you need to understand about Atmos is it's, in my opinion, a fairly complex solution. Think about the evolution of Atmos. It started as a broadcast and cinema tool that was used for encoding films, right, like Brave and these things, right? And then Dolby decided that they wanted to make it available to the music production community and for gamers and things like that. So they created some plugins that give you kind of that front-end tool that enables you to produce the audio that you then take to the audio renderer, right? So you've got your DAW with its plugins, you have the audio bridge, you have the renderer. Somebody who's got a fairly basic or light technical background would have a really, really steep learning curve on this technology. So that's a consideration. Fortunately, they do have a lot of really, really great training material. But again, that will only take you so far, right? It does have support for higher order ambisonics, which is nice. It does have backward compatibility, for their older devices. So if you've got a home theater system, you want to listen to some Dolby Atmos tracks, you can do that. It doesn't sound quite right, but it will work. And then it'll give you 128 tracks, which would be more than enough for most applications. Lastly, the production suite is available for Mac only. So if you're a PC guy like me, you're out of luck. Go buy yourself a Mac before you can use the Dolby Atmos tools. Okay, and then just a quick roundup. So, if you're producing spatial audio, 3D audio for streaming, if it's audio, Atmos is probably your best bet in spite of all those considerations I just gave you. They've really done a great job of proliferating this format in so many devices. If you're streaming audio, you can get your stuff up on Tidal, you can get it up on Apple Music, you can get it up on a number of different services. This is the way I would go. If you're doing 360 video, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, whatever, Facebook 360 or Resonance Audio are the way to go. Mobile, as we said, Resonance is a great way to go. VR and AR, either Oculus or Deer VR, just because they've got great tools for the audio engines, the game engines, and that will really help you in your development work there. For live events and installations, I highly recommend Envelop. That's a tool that is really optimized for use in live installations, and it used to just be a plugin. Now it's a series of tools for controlling things like lights, things like that. So you've got an installation, multi-speaker, you want to have some lights and stuff going on. This is an amazing suite of tools for that. And then for higher order ambisonics, Deer VR and Resonance Audio. All right, I'm going to keep rolling. Another picture to help us. This one's a little busy. It's a picture of the audio spectrum, but I really like the way this encompasses both musical instruments as well as sound effects. In the upper left, at the upper band, you've got the frequencies going from left to right. So the audio spectrum starting at around 20 hertz, all the way up to the frequencies that only your dog hears, which is 16K, 20K, right? Same thing at the bottom. I want to draw your attention to the lower left-hand corner. You'll notice down in this kind of 20 to 40 hertz range, we see rumble, right? So this is where, let's say, the rumble of a truck, right, or a tank, right, motorcycle, whatever. That's kind of where these frequencies would live on the audio spectrum. And then we're going to move up a little bit higher. When you hear the hum, of an AC device, right, transformers, that's typically around the 60 to 70, 80 hertz range. We're going to move up a little bit higher, getting up to around 1,500 hertz or so, 2K hertz. That's where you'd hear things like a slap, like that, right, would be kind of in that range. And then moving up, right? We're going to come back to this in a moment. I want to talk a little bit about best practices. And this is where I'm hoping that I can share some of the issues, some of the pain that I've experienced in working in this space and then working with some of my clients. I'm going to go through these quickly. There are many more. I really tried to boil it down to what I thought would be kind of the top 10. And we'll bounce back to that audio spectrum picture in a moment so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. So number one, use monophonic point sources. So thinking about our 360 sphere, our ultra high-tech model here, most people would think, if you want to spread sound in this space, you would just have, 50 sound sources, just let them all go. You have sound everywhere, right? That's actually counterintuitive. It's not accurate, actually. The better solution is to have a single point source and then let the spatializer do its work. And the reason is because that gives you much more fine-grained control over that sound source and how it's going to move and morph and change over time, right, based on user action. Next up, we want to talk about sine waves. Sine waves are a single frequency sound source, right? If you think about a sine wave, they're great for test tones. They're really, really bad if you're doing sound design, or music production. The reason is because it's a single frequency, the HRTFs, head-related transfer functions, and the spatializers have very, very little information to work with. And so what happens is when you try to spatialize a sine wave, it just sounds bad. There's no other word to describe it. It doesn't really spatialize well. It's really, really hard for the listener to track and sort of understand where it is, where it lives in the sound space, right? So moving on to number 3, when you spatialize content, you really want to give the spatializers as much frequency content material as possible to work with, right? So think about something like an explosion, right? Or somebody screaming or yelling, right? Or a violin or an instrument like that. These are devices, these are sound sources that have, lots of rich frequency information that will make the HRTF and the spatializer's job much, much easier. Thinking about our audio spectrum, sounds that are above 1500 hertz are far easier to localize than sounds that are very, very low in frequency. And I think we've all had this experience, right? You're sitting at a light in your car. There's somebody in a car somewhere near you that has those deep subwoofers going, boom, 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 right? And you're listening going, where is that coming from? I can't tell, right? You're looking around you. The reason is because those low frequency signals, they just go everywhere, right? And they're really, really hard for your ears to track and determine where that sound is coming from. And again, so number 5, it's difficult for the brain to localize frequencies that are sounds that are low in frequency. When you're talking about audio format, we talked about monophonic a little bit ago. When you're switching between formats, let's say from mono to stereo or mono to something else, you really want to avoid that in the instance of like a VR app or a game. And the reason is because when you switch formats like that, the likelihood of pops and clicks and dropouts goes up significantly. So pick a format, right? Say, okay, everything's a monophonic point source. Maybe my music is stereo, maybe narration is a couple of point sources, and then just stick with that for your application. Number 7, there are some things that just really don't need to be spatialized, right? Music, if you're talking about a VR situation, mobile games, mobile apps, it's very easy to find yourself in a situation where you've just got all this stuff going on and you can't really tell where sounds are coming from or how you're trying to guide and direct the listener. So narration, typically a point source somewhere in your space. Music, if you have it, make it a stereo source. If you need to spatialize sound effects or special elements, that's okay. And then the rest of it, just leave it alone. Spatialization, reverbs do cost you CPU cycles. If you're in an embedded platform on a wireless headset, that will chew up your CPU. And what will start to happen is things will start to get slow. The response time will go down, right? And that becomes a problem. So number 8, when you're producing binaural audio, right? So I'm going to go back to, again, our super technology-wise example, right? You're listening on these guys. There's an immediacy and an intimacy that goes along with listening with headphones as opposed to being in a room like this where you've got speakers and you're listening, right? When people are listening over headphones, you need to think about ear fatigue. You need to think about overwhelming the user. You need to think about just too much material where after 5-10 minutes they're just going to be so overwhelmed they're going to turn it off, right? I call it the MVP, minimum viable product, right? only as many sound sources as you need to create the effect, right? Don't overwhelm them with too much reverb, too many sound sources, just enough to convey the information and no more. Number 9, audio artifacts, right? So this again, if you've got field recordings, if you have recordings you've made at home, maybe some, offshore producer or something, really give it a listen with headphones. Make sure there aren't any pops and clicks. Pops, clicks, dropouts, hard cuts. Those things will break that sense of immersion, that immersive experience for your listeners. And lastly, number 10, audio latency. So this is one that I see a lot with haptic controllers, wireless VR controllers. You really want to keep the latency between the user action and the response in the game or the mobile app or whatever the application is to 20 milliseconds or less. I've seen some websites where they've done studies, they have papers and they talk about, 60 milliseconds is okay, 80 milliseconds is okay. Don't go there. 20 milliseconds, right? Keep it to that range. It's not that hard to do, if you've got, fairly robust CPU. You really want that action to be immediate. Wireless has its own set of issues. That's something else you'll need to time and quantify, but you really want to keep it to that 20 millisecond range. And in particular, head tracking, right? When we're talking about head tracking responsiveness. Okay, so now some common issues, kind of the flip side, right, of the best practices. This is a compilation of things that I've encountered, both in the work that I've done, work with our clients. Starting at the top, number 1, audio strategy. When you think about audio, this comes back to an earlier comment. You want to think about it as a user experience element. Don't think about it as just sound. I need sound, or music. I need music, or I need narration. It's part of your user experience, right? So, what do you want to do with the sound? Do you want to guide and direct the user? Do you want them to feel something? Do you want them to see something as a foreshadow that's about to happen? Do you want them to remember something that happened in the past? What's the purpose and role for the audio? That's where I would start. The other is starting on audio late in the production cycle. I've had this happen a number of times with clients. When you're in pre-production on your VR game, AR game, podcast, whatever it may be, you want to think about the audio right from the very beginning, because there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of tweaking, a lot of back and forth iterations that are required working in this space. It can get complicated very, very quickly, and you want to give yourself, the audio production folks, the other people working on audio, enough time to really develop, hone, refine the audio so that it gives a great user experience. Moving on to sound design, number 3, no room ambiance. Room ambiance is one of those things that you can do for very, very little in terms of, complexity, CPU cycles, right, that sort of thing. If you think about the room that we're in right now, if you could get me to shut up for a couple of minutes, you could hear the room, right? You'd hear the sounds of the people in the hallway. You'd hear the HVAC system, probably some hum from the lights, right? Maybe some hum from the audio system. Those are details that you can implement really, really easily without a whole lot of work, and they add this extra level of realism to the scene. If it's an outdoor scene, maybe it's, the rustle of leaves, wind, water in the background, something like that, right? Again, subtlety is really, really good. Don't overdo it. Number 4, too many or too few sound effects. Again, this is a situation where, I call it soup, right? You put on the headset, you play the experience, and there's like 50 things going on, right? There's just all this stuff going on. There's music, there's narration, there's explosions. You're like, I don't understand what this is. What am I supposed to be doing here, right? Recommendation is cut it all down to 0, build it back up little by little, and figure out what's the minimal number of sound effects, sound sources, music, narration that you need to convey what you want to convey in the scene, and no more. Too much reverb and delay. Okay, so there's a lot of sound designers, folks like that, that I work with, right, who just think that reverb and delay are great for everything, right? You want this big space, you want this big sound, lots of reverb, right? We all live in this huge canyon out in the middle of nowhere, right? It's like, again, it's soup, right? You're going to wind up with a situation where the audio is just going to be washed out. Right? It's going to be difficult to tell, where is this vehicle coming from? Where is this zombie coming from? Right? I can't tell because it's all just kind of this big mess of reverb, right? So use reverb and delay sparingly, just a teeny bit, as much as you need, right? And it costs you CPU cycles. Reverbs are really, really expensive as far as CPU cycles, so use them sparingly. And again, long audio latency, right? This has a big impact on head tracking, on devices. Then let's talk about music for a minute. Okay, so I see this a lot on YouTube. I see this a lot in VR games, right? AR games, where we've got an experience, we're in a situation, a setting, a room, a canyon, whatever, and we need some music. So it just so happens that the producer is a really big EDM fan, so they just throw some EDM music in there, right? So now you're in the situation, right? I don't know, you're in a room somewhere in a cave, there's bad guys, whatever, and you're hearing the, and you're like, okay, so how does this music fit with what's going on here, right? Somebody's about to die, right? We're in this really scary situation. I can't tell if I'm in a cave or if I'm in a rave party, right? It's like, what is this, right? It causes confusion, right? The users start to pay attention to the music, they forget about the scene. It's like, you really want music that fits and is appropriate to the particular scene that you're in, right? No more, no less. Again, it overpowers the scene, right? Distracts the user. Difficult to hear over the sound design. I see this a lot in film, cinema broadcasts, where you've just got all this sound effects, right? Music, rumble, battlefield going on and stuff, right? And there's music somewhere in there, right? But you can't really hear it because the sound effects are just completely obliterating this music, right? Here's my recommendation. Pull out a spectrogram, figure out where all of the sound effects are happening. Chances are it's all low frequency stuff, right? And reproduce, rearrange, orchestrate your music so that it's happening where the sound effects are not. It's a little bit more work, but that will give you biggest bang for your buck. The sound effects have their place in the mix. The music has its place in the mix. Everybody's happy. And then lastly, audio cuts. I see this problem a lot as well. Crossfading is your friend, hard cuts are not. If you have a scene where there's music playing, there's sound effects going on, and then suddenly the music stops, that's really, really jarring for the listener, right? You want to, at most, crossfade it out and crossfade something else in, right? Or you want to have some way to gracefully pull the audio out if it's music or sound effects. You don't want things to just suddenly stop because that, again, will break the experience for the listener. Okay, thank you for hanging in there. I realize it's a lot of information. There's way more where that came from. I really tried to boil it down to just the essential things that you need to know as a consumer or as a developer. If you'd like copies of these slides, please head out to our site, immersiveexperiencestudios.com. Contact us. Just need your email and just give me a single line that says, Hackfort 2021. Happy to share these with you. I have an online class that I'm developing with some partners, some business partners back in California. And that will be online about beginning of the year, where we'll go into this stuff in way more detail. Actually have some projects that you can download and actually work on for yourself. We'll cover all of these audio solutions in great detail. We expect that to be done sometime around beginning of the year. I can give you information about that if you're interested in that course. We also have a free guide, how to deliver a compelling experience through 3D and spatial audio. You can get that at our website, immersiveexperiencestudios.com. About halfway down the page, there's a little thing that says Get the Guide. You can click on it, get that for free. And if you'd like to stay in touch, David Reyes at immersiveexperiencestudios.com. I'm also on LinkedIn and on YouTube. And then some additional resources. This first one, Art and Science of Sound Recording, these are my two business partners, Alan Parsons and Julian Kolbeck. This is an amazing resource. I've used this a couple of times to train some offshore teams in audio production, audio reproduction techniques. It's a really, really great way to understand audio production in a real nuts and bolts way. It's not specific to spatial audio. The spatial audio class will be an adjunct to this. But this is really great if you want to really understand, how do I mix music? How do I record music? How do I master music? How do I develop sound effects? How do I know that I'm doing this correctly? This is a really, really great resource. It is accurate and it is really, really clear. The Ambisonics book, which I have here, this is a really awesome read. It's a nice blend between technical and theory and practical. It's available online for free. I bought mine just because I like to have the hard copy, but you can get that online for free. Dolby, of course, has a number of training resources. Again, it's a complicated solution, so if you're going to dive into the world of Atmos, give yourself some time if you're on a project or you're thinking about a project to really ramp up on the technology, go through all their tutorials. They've got some good stuff. It's getting better. We work with them, actually. And then Oculus. Oculus has a really awesome developers site which has a lot of really, really great information. They do a nice job. Audio Engineering Society, if you're a math and science geek like me, you want to dig into the math and some of the, the artwork of this 3D and spatial audio, highly recommend that. There's no end to the papers you can read about spatial audio and 3D audio, ambisonics, and the like. Lastly, Unreal has this online demo called the Spatial Audio Temple. This is a really great example of audio in Unreal. I think it's really, really well done. It's a live, online site with some great examples, some downloadable projects, lots of good documentation about Unreal. And then lastly, about us, right? We're here to help. We're located here in the Treasure Valley. We really love the community. We really think that 3D and spatial audio are a game changer. It can be used for anything from podcasts to social to VR to mobile. We're here to help. And I want to say thank you for hanging in there with us. Have a great show. Have a great afternoon. And I'll be around after the presentation if you want to catch up, talk about this a little bit more.
We do have a couple minutes. Are you open to doing any Q&A, David?
Oh, sure.
Awesome. Folks, do we have any questions in the room for David?
So I have a question about producing spatial audio. And so I'm not a developer, but I make audio art and podcasts.
Right.
And so I'm wondering, now when I create a scene, I'll use, say, a binaural mic and just set it in a place, get stereo audio. It sounds kind of spatial, but when you move your head, it doesn't follow your head. It doesn't do head tracking.
Right.
So when you're trying to record a scene like that, that would support head tracking,
right,
do you use a binaural mic? Do you use a specialty mic that is directional on several?
I see what you're saying.
How do you do that?
Yeah. What kind of microphone do you use now?
I have a 3DO binaural mic, the one with the little silicone ears.
Okay. So it's an ambisonic mic then, and it gives you audio out. It gives you audio out in A format or B format. Do you know?
No, it's just stereo.
So I got
just
you.
a stereo.
Just stereo mic. Yep. Okay. So you're trying to record. If I'm hearing you correctly, you're trying to record. You want to record spatial audio for your application, right? Which I think you said
say for a podcast.
For a podcast, right. Okay. So there are a number of ambisonic microphones out there, and I can give you my contact info. If you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to give you a list of them. Sennheiser has one. Rode has one. There's a number of them, right? Zoom has a device, a portable recording device that does ambisonics, right? So I think your first question is how to record ambisonic audio. You have to use an ambisonic mic, right? That's a first order ambisonic. It's got 4 microphones, right, to record the sound, coincident mics. Then for head tracking, you can do a couple of different ways. So, for example, Waves has a device that you would clip on to, your headset or your earphones or whatever, right? It's a Bluetooth device that will record head tracking information as you make your audio recording, right? So that's one way to do it, right? If you have a headset, like a VR headset, if you're using that in your application, right, you can also use that to do head tracking, right? Another way to do it is in the actual audio production itself, you can add automation information about the head tracking, although that's not quite as accurate, right? So first is use an ambisonic mic to truly capture the sound field in a 360 format, right? And the second is have some sort of device where you can record head tracking information. I think that was your question.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a live rendering of head tracking, right? In the case of like a VR or an AR application, right, where you want to track what the user is doing at that moment as far as their head tracking, that's a little different. That is something that you would build in using the game engine, where you build in state information, right? Like if the user turns to the left, you want to do this with the audio. If they turn to the right, you want to do this with the audio. If they pan really, really fast or really, really slow, those are use cases that you can account for as you're building your experience in a game engine.
Yeah, that answers my question, definitely. Because I think what's interesting about it to me is that with those binaural stereo mics, you get so much accurate, it sounds really accurate information of the room.
True.
And I was wondering, with ambisonic mics,
Yep.
are you getting that accurate of spatial information?
Yeah, you are. Yeah, and there's some theory behind that, right? So I want to, again, I'm not trying to overwhelm you with theory and
No,
math,
sure.
right? But there is a theory, right? It goes all the way back to, I'm just giving you a little bit on this, right? Because I'm such a geek for this stuff. I'm going to go back to here. So you notice down in the bottom left-hand corner, we didn't really talk about this, right? So this timeline for ambisonics really begins in 1931, believe it or not, with this gentleman named Blumlein, who's the guy who filed the first patents around stereophony, right? So if you think about two-channel stereo, that's where all that came from, right? And so what he determined was that if you take two microphones and place them coincident like this, there's some math behind that, right? You can capture, they call it MS or XY, you can capture a certain amount of information around the sound field. That theory is then expanded to include these 4 virtual mics, which is how you capture, which is how ambisonics came to be, right? It was built off of this original theory. So the answer to your question is 2 mics, you could have 50 mics, right? Which is cool, but that won't really capture the sound field in an ambisonic manner. You really need an ambisonic microphone because of the way the sound capsules for the microphone are placed. And they're placed in such a way where, again, you're capturing the directional information of the sound field and not so much just the sound sources themselves. When you get that, you then get a file that gives you these 4 tracks of audio, right? W, X, Y, and Z. And that's how you determine, that's how you can then process it to really create a 360 field.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
Yep, and there are some inexpensive
Interesting.
ambisonic mics. You don't have to spend a lot of money, right? I mean, you can, right? If you want to spend $2,000 on an ambisonic mic, you certainly can. You can get an ambisonic mic for, $200, $300, $400, all the way up to, like I said, a couple of $1,000s, right? And then you need some software, right? You need some software to then take it, bring it into a DAW or a game engine, right? Process it, work with it.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, that answers
What
my
do you use
question.
for a DAW? Do you have like Pro
Yeah, I
Tools?
use
or-
Pro Tools.
Pro
yeah.
Tools? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you use Pro Tools, latest version? I forget what it's called. Pro Tools?
I think it's the
Ultimate?
version from last year.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and so Pro Tools supports Dolby Atmos out of the box, right?
Cool,
Pro Tools
yeah.
Ultimate. But if you don't want to use Pro Tools, you don't have to because all these other solutions have plugins, right? So like for example, Resonance Audio, right? With the
Yeah.
exception of Envelop, Resonance
Yeah.
Audio has their own plugin, right? So you can use that.
Gotcha. Cool.
But yeah, definitely. I've got some cards up here if you want to grab
Yeah,
one.
I'll send you an
I'm happy
email,
to stay in touch with you and help you out wherever I can. Yep.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. Sure.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you guys. Let's give David a big hand and thank him for his time.
Thank you, guys. And I'll probably be back next year with some more examples of this. Right, I want to do kind of a series of these because there's a lot to talk about. I really tried to just give you in this presentation, enough information where you can go out there and start working with this technology, right? Or when you're looking for it, if you're consuming it, you really know what you're looking for. Next year, I want to come back with some more concrete examples, some things we can walk through as far as listening to it, processing it, working with it. Awesome. Thank you very much. And I'll be around a little bit later if you guys want to talk.